Okay, people talk an awful lot about transparency, and on one level it sounds fine, but what exactly do you mean by it? What I'm getting at with transparency here is really the quality and timeliness of the information process. And all things being equal, a good decision will come out of better quality and more timely information. Relevant information, however, may simply not be available because we don't understand the causal models that result in effects. So, for example, when CFCs were invented in the 1930s, you couldn't understand that they were going to be dangerous. It's only later on when Rolla de Molina looked at what would happen with those chemicals when they floated up into the atmosphere that we began to realize that it would interact with ozone and destroy the ozone layer. So there's an information problem even when we are really trying hard. But of course, information is a strategic resource. If I have some information that you don't have, then I can use it to my benefit. This, of course, happens all the time on the stock market through insider trading. In politics, it can happen when you don't release information that you know will damage your position, but may have a broader public interest. So the problem becomes politically that we have non-transparent information, which means it's not good quality information, it's not timely available. This poses enormous problems for good environmental decision making. Well, how transparent were these two processes? The RPDC confronted a major problem because it was constantly having to beat off the pulp mill task force's information. Pulp mill task force provided a lot of information, but it was highly biased towards supporting pulp mills. So it wasn't that the information was necessarily wrong or inaccurate, it was simply that it left out a great deal. To be fair to the RPDC, however, it did collect, collate, review large quantities of information coming from all sorts of different sources, including the proponent, the government, interest groups, and the general public. So one way of trying to sift through and figure out what's good information, what isn't, is simply to triangulate or cross-reference the information you're getting. The RPDC was also able to use its own resources to hire consultants and have them do a due diligence assessment of the gun submission and the various consultants that it had hired. So there was an effort, at least, within the RPDC to separate spin from fact and to rectify omissions. Now, I don't want to go after the individual consultants of either Swaco PIC or ITS Global. I'm sure they did a good professional job within their own structures. But what I would say is they were constrained by the terms of reference they were given, and those terms of reference were very narrow. We know now that they were operating on the basis of deficient information following Cooper's letter that was not sent to guns. We also know, and consultants do this all the time, and I'm sure Swaco PIC's officials and ITS Global would agree, they wrote their reports with an eye to persuade. How else could you have a nice round 100 assessment criteria? That takes us on then to accountability. Conventional definition of accountability is a vertical one. It looks at accountability up and accountability down. The obligation to answer for a responsibility conferred. This is a traditional notion of accountability where you delegate responsibility to someone and then you check to see whether they've done what they said they would do. There is a new ethic of accountability emerging, however, and it relates to all affected persons. This is the notion of horizontal accountability. You're not merely accountable to who's appointed you to do something, you're accountable to the broader public for what you do. And the more powerful you are, the more accountable you are. Accountability, if you think about it, and Robert Keohane has commented, is a power relation. Nobody wants to be accountable. It's a pain to be called to task for what you've done or intend to do. So everyone tries to get out from under accountability. And the struggle is, in a sense, to make those who would try to do that accountable. Well, how accountable were these two processes? Clearly, the RPDC process was vertically accountable to the government. It was appointed by the government, and it handed its report to the government. But it did seem to exercise some level of horizontal accountability to those affected by its decision. Its general objective as a planning institution is to act as an intermediary between the forces of politics and, if you like, the public interest. It's there as a buffer to prevent merely power politics from playing out in terms of the planning process. And it did seem to be holding guns accountable for its IIS and for its supplementary information. What about the PMAA? Well, clearly it too was vertically accountable to guns, but it does not appear to have had any formal requirement for horizontal accountability to those most affected. Moreover, while individuals within those organizations, that's SWACO Peak and ITF Global, may have felt some level of professional ethics in terms of horizontal accountability, we simply don't know how that played out in terms of the meetings, because we have no access to that, because that process is client privileged information. Third category is openness, and here you have to focus on what political scientists call policy networks. As I said before, the ministerial notion of autonomy has given way to a much more nuanced notion of governance, in which there's a range of actors involved, and those actors are often conceptualized as participating in policy networks, and these can involve governments, obviously, but also business, NGOs, academics, and scientists. And policy networks can vary very much in the degree to which they're open and closed to other interests. And when you have policy networks that are very closed, you get policies that service those interests, sometimes to the detriment of the public interest. Good environmental governance requires open policy networks so that interests that are crucial are not closed off. Well, what about the two processes in terms of openness? RPDC worked within a context of a closed policy network, that is the Forest Policy Network, that constantly challenged its authority through especially the Pulp Mill Task Force. That said, the RPDC process was open to a considerable extent to a wide variety of different groups with different interests and values, and they all had an opportunity at least to have their say through the submissions process, and a huge number were submitted, of course, but many of those were simply faxed submissions from the Wilderness Society, which really don't, to be honest, count for a great deal. Nonetheless, if you strip those out, there was still a significant contribution to the RPDC process.